The Winchester rifle cracked across the valley like thunder, and Douglas Howard dropped from his saddle before the echo faded. His men scrambled for cover behind the rocks, but Barbara Gomez was already moving, her weathered boots silent on the pine needles as she shifted position. The morning mist clung to the ridgeline, and she used it like a curtain, appearing and vanishing with the patience of someone who had learned to kill professionally. Kyle Bennett pressed his back against a boulder, sweat beading despite the mountain cold. This was not how it was supposed to go. The quiet widow who ran the little saloon in Copper Creek was supposed to be easy prey, a woman alone with no one to protect her. They had taken her prize stallion, Midnight, expecting tears and pleading. Instead, they had awakened something that should have stayed buried. She had given them one warning 3 days ago, just one. Her voice had been calm as creek water when she said it. You took something that belongs to me. Bring him back, or I will come for you. Bennett had laughed then, his men joining in. What could one woman do against 6 armed men? Now he knew. The rifle spoke again, and Gary Green cried out as the bullet took his gun hand clean off at the wrist. Barbara Gomez did not waste ammunition on killing shots when a lesson would suffice. She had learned economy of violence in places where bullets were precious and mistakes were fatal. Every shot served a purpose, delivered with the precision of someone who had once been paid to make impossible shots from impossible distances. Bennett tried to spot her muzzle flash, but she was already gone from that position. Somewhere in his panicked mind, he remembered stories told in whispers around campfires. Stories about a woman who had ridden with the federal marshals back when the territories were wild and lawless. They called her the Copper Creek Ghost, but that was just legend, wasn't it? Before we see how this ends, tell us where you are watching from and hype this video in the comments. 3 days earlier, Barbara Gomez had been kneading bread dough in the back room of her saloon when she heard the horses approach. The sound carried differently when riders meant trouble. Something about the way they held their reins, the spacing of the hoofbeats. She wiped flour from her hands and stepped to the window, her gray eyes taking in details that most people would miss. 6 men, well-armed, riding expensive horses. The leader sat his saddle with the arrogance of someone who had never met meaningful resistance. His clothes were clean, his boots polished. Not working men then, not locals. The kind who came to small towns expecting to take what they wanted without consequence. She had built her life in Copper Creek around being invisible, unremarkable. The widow who had arrived 5 years ago with enough money to buy the failing saloon and enough sense to keep to herself. She served drinks, cooked meals, and asked no questions about the men who drifted through seeking work or running from trouble. It was a quiet life, and she had earned that quiet through years of violence that still visited her dreams. The men dismounted and tied their horses to the rail. Barbara smoothed her apron and walked to the bar, her movements calm and measured. She had learned long ago that panic was a luxury she could not afford. The leader pushed through the bat-wing doors first, his pale eyes sweeping the room before settling on her. He was younger than she had expected, maybe 35, with the soft look of someone who let others do his killing. Behind him came 5 more, spreading out in a pattern that spoke of military training or criminal experience. Good afternoon, gentlemen, Barbara said, her voice carrying the slight rasp that came from years of breathing gun smoke and trail dust. What can I get you? The leader smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. Douglas Howard, ma'am, we are not here for drinks. She waited, her hands resting lightly on the bar. Patience was another skill she had learned in her previous life, the ability to let silence work for her. We hear you have a fine black stallion, Howard continued. Midnight, I believe. We would like to make you an offer. He is not for sale, Barbara replied. Everything is for sale, ma'am. It is just a matter of price. Not everything, she said quietly. Howard's smile faded. Perhaps I was not clear. We are taking the horse. The question is whether we leave payment or not. Barbara studied the 6 men, her trained eye cataloging weapons, stance, experience level. The leader was soft, but the others were harder cases. Kyle Bennett stood by the door, his hand resting on his gun butt. Nathan Ramos leaned against the wall, a knife scar running from his ear to his jaw. Professional killers, or close enough. I suggest you leave before this gets complicated, she said. Bennett laughed, a harsh sound in the quiet saloon. Complicated. You hear that, boys? The lady thinks she can complicate things for us. Howard stepped closer to the bar, close enough that she could smell the pomade in his hair. Ma'am, I appreciate your spirit, but you are one woman alone. We are 6 men who take what we want. Your horse is already gone. My men took him while we have been talking. Barbara's expression did not change, but something shifted in her eyes, a coldness that made Howard step back despite himself. You made a mistake, she said softly. The only mistake would be trying to stop us, Howard replied, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. That was your warning, Barbara said. The next one will not miss. The men filed out, their laughter echoing in the empty saloon. Barbara stood motionless until the sound of their horses faded, then walked to the window and watched them ride toward the hills, with Midnight on a lead rope. The stallion fought the restraint, his black coat gleaming in the afternoon sun. She had raised him from a colt, trained him herself. He was the last gift from her husband before the fever took him. She closed the saloon early and climbed the stairs to her private rooms. In the bedroom, she moved the wardrobe aside and pried up the loose floorboard beneath. The oiled cloth package had waited 5 years for her to need it again. Inside were things she had hoped never to touch again. The badge was tarnished silver, the words United States Marshal barely visible. Beneath it lay a leather gun belt, worn smooth by years of wear, the holster shaped to a Colt Peacemaker that had never failed her. At the bottom of the package, wrapped in silk, was a brass telescope and a small leather journal filled with her careful handwriting. Range cards, wind calculations, notes on long-distance shooting that had made her legend. Barbara Gomez had not always been a saloon keeper. Before she came to Copper Creek, before she married Thomas and tried to build a peaceful life, she had been Deputy Marshal Barbara Santos, the Copper Creek ghost, the woman who could track a whisper across stone and put a bullet through a silver dollar at 400 yards. She strapped on the gun belt, the weight familiar against her hips. The Colt slid from leather like water, the action smooth and deadly. She had practiced in secret, maintaining skills she hoped never to use again. Some things once learned then could never be forgotten. The next morning she followed their trail into the high country. They had not bothered to hide their tracks, confident that a lone woman would never pursue them. Their arrogance would cost them everything. The trail led through pine forest and across granite ridges, climbing toward the old mining camps where outlaws often made their temporary homes. Barbara read the ground like scripture, seeing not just hoof prints, but the story they told. Howard's horse favored its left front foot. Bennett's mount was nervous, shying at shadows. They had stopped twice to rest, once to water their horses at Willow Creek. She found their camp in a box canyon, hidden behind a screen of aspen trees. 6 men, confident in their isolation, had posted no guards. Midnight was picketed with their horses, his ears pricked forward when he caught her scent on the wind. Barbara settled into position on the rim of the canyon, 300 yards above their camp. The brass telescope revealed every detail. Howard sat by the fire, counting money from a leather pouch. Bennett cleaned his rifle with the care of someone who knew weapons. The others played cards or dozed in the afternoon sun. She could have killed them all from that position. 3 minutes, 6 shots, 6 dead men. It would have been clean, professional, final. But 5 years of peace had changed her. She wanted them to understand what they had awakened before she finished them. That night, she moved through their camp like smoke. Bennett woke to find his rifle gone, the firing pin removed and tossed into the fire. Nathan Ramos discovered his knife missing from its sheath, the blade driven deep into a tree trunk 20 feet away. Gary Green found his boots filled with pine needles, his socks tied in knots. In the morning, they found a message carved into the bark of the largest aspen. You were warned, last chance. Howard raged and cursed, but his men were spooked. They had slept through an attack by a ghost, their weapons taken without a sound. Bennett suggested they cut their losses and run, but Howard's pride would not let him back down to a woman. They tried to leave the canyon, but Barbara was waiting. The first shot took Howard's hat clean off his head. The second shattered Bennett's rifle stock. The third sent Nathan Ramos diving for cover behind a fallen log. You want to fight? Howard shouted at the empty rocks. Come down here and fight like a man. The answering shot split the log Ramos was hiding behind, splinters exploding around his head. He scrambled to new cover, his face white with fear. She is up there, somewhere, Bennett whispered. We need to flank her. They tried, spreading out to climb the canyon walls, but Barbara had anticipated every move. She appeared and vanished like a mirage, always one step ahead, always in perfect position. When Kyle Bennett thought he had her cornered, he found only empty rocks and a brass cartridge case, still warm from firing. The siege lasted 2 days. Barbara controlled the high ground, the water, the only way out of the canyon. She picked off their supplies with surgical precision, destroying their coffee, their hardtack, their ammunition. When they tried to rush her position, she drove them back with shots that missed by inches, warnings that could have been killing strokes. On the second night, Gary Green broke. He tried to slip away on foot, abandoning his horse and companions. Barbara let him reach the canyon mouth before putting a bullet through his boot heel, sending him sprawling. When he looked back, she was standing on the rim like an avenging angel, her rifle glinting in the moonlight. "Go home," she called down. "Tell them what you found here." Green ran into the darkness, his nerve completely shattered. The remaining 4 men huddled around their dying fire, jumping at every sound. They were professionals, or had been, but this was beyond their experience. They were being hunted by something that moved like wind and shot like divine judgment. The end came with the dawn. Barbara appeared at the canyon mouth, walking slowly toward their camp. She carried her rifle casually, but her every movement spoke of deadly competence. The morning mist swirled around her boots, and for a moment she looked exactly like the ghost the old-timers whispered about. Howard drew his pistol with the desperate speed of a man with nothing left to lose. Barbara's Colt cleared leather and fired before he could bring his weapon to bear. The bullet took him through the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to the ground. His pistol flew into the rocks, unfired. Bennett and Ramos reached for their guns, but Barbara was already moving, the rifle in her hands like a living thing. 2 shots, 2 men down, both wounded but alive. She could have killed them all, but mercy was another thing she had learned in her years of peace. Nathan Ramos clutched his shattered wrist, staring at the woman who had destroyed them so completely. "You are her," he whispered. "The Copper Creek ghost." Barbara walked to where Midnight stood picketed, the stallion nickering softly at her approach. She untied the lead rope and swung onto his back without using a saddle, her movements fluid and natural. "I gave you a warning," she said, looking down at the broken men. "You chose not to listen." "Who are you?" Howard gasped through his pain. "Barbara Gomez, keeper of the Copper Creek Saloon, widow of Thomas Santos. And before that, Deputy United States Marshal Barbara Santos. Some people called me the Ghost." She touched her heels to Midnight's flanks and rode out of the canyon, leaving the 4 men to contemplate their mistakes. By the time they managed to bind their wounds and catch their scattered horses, she was long gone. A legend riding back into legend. The story might have ended there, but Douglas Howard was not a man who accepted defeat gracefully. He was the son of a railroad baron, accustomed to buying his way out of problems that could not be solved with violence. His wounded pride festered like an infected wound as he recovered in the doctor's office in Silver Falls, 30 miles from Copper Creek. Howard sent telegrams east, calling in favors and hiring specialists. If one woman could destroy his men, then he would bring enough firepower to level the entire town. Money opened doors and loosened tongues, and soon he had assembled a small army of mercenaries and gunfighters. Jack Robinson arrived first, a thin man with pale eyes and a reputation for backshooting. He had killed 17 men, or so he claimed, though most of them had been farmers and shopkeepers who could not defend themselves. Dorothy Ruiz came next, a woman as hard as winter iron who had ridden with Quantrill's raiders during the war. Hannah Castillo and Gloria Cox were sisters who specialized in arson and intimidation. The last to arrive was Nathan Ramos's brother, Diego, a man whose cruelty was legendary even among outlaws. He had come seeking revenge for his brother's shattered wrist and wounded pride. Together, they formed a group that would have terrified any normal town into submission. But Copper Creek was not a normal town, and Barbara Gomez was not a normal woman. She had expected retaliation. Men like Howard did not slink away quietly after being humiliated. She had used the 2 weeks since the canyon incident to prepare, sending letters to old friends and calling in favors of her own. The response had been swift and sure. Deputy Marshal Thomas Garrett arrived on the noon stage, his badge hidden but his purpose clear. He was followed by Sarah Mitchell, a former Army scout who owed Barbara her life from a long-ago firefight in Apache territory. By evening, 3 more had arrived. Men and women who had ridden with Barbara Santos in the days when justice was measured in powder and lead. The townspeople of Copper Creek had always suspected their quiet saloon keeper was more than she appeared. The way she moved, the scars on her hands, the careful way she watched strangers all spoke of a violent past. Now, as armed figures gathered like storm clouds, they began to understand what kind of tempest was about to break. Barbara called a meeting in the saloon after closing time. The assembled group looked like a gathering of legends, each carrying weapons and memories of battles fought in defense of law and order. They were older now, some gray-haired and scarred, but their eyes still held the hard gleam of professional competence. "Howard is bringing an army," Barbara said without preamble. "Maybe 20 men, all killers. They will be here by week's end." "Then we should leave," suggested Doc Patterson, the town's elderly physician. "No shame in strategic withdrawal." Barbara shook her head. "This is my home now. My husband is buried in the cemetery on the hill. I will not be driven from his grave by a spoiled rich boy's temper tantrum." Sarah Mitchell leaned forward, her weathered face grim. "How do you want to play this, Ghost?" The old nickname brought a slight smile to Barbara's lips. "We make them come to us, turn the town into a fortress, and let them break themselves against our defenses." Over the next 3 days, Copper Creek was transformed. Windows were boarded up with gun ports cut for rifles. The general store became an ammunition depot. The church bell tower was converted into a sniper's nest with clear fields of fire down the main street. The townspeople who chose to stay were armed and positioned. Those with families were evacuated to the hills, leaving only the fighters and those too stubborn to run. Barbara walked among them, calm and confident, her presence steadying nerves and stiffening resolve. On the 4th day, Howard's army appeared on the ridge overlooking the town. They came like a plague of locusts. 23 hard cases and killers drawn by the promise of easy money and easier violence. Howard himself rode at their head, his arms still in a sling, but his eyes burning with the need for revenge. They made camp just out of rifle range and sent a messenger under a white flag. The man was young and nervous, clearly not a fighter, but some clerk or assistant pressed into dangerous service. "Mr. Howard wants to parley," the messenger said, his voice cracking slightly. Barbara stood in the middle of the street, her rifle cradled casually in her arms. "Tell Mr. Howard that he received his parley in the canyon. This is what comes after." The messenger rode back, and an hour later the first shots rang out. Howard had positioned sharpshooters on the ridge, hoping to pick off defenders from long range. But Barbara had anticipated this, and her own marksmen were ready. The battle for Copper Creek began with a duel between snipers, rifles cracking across the valley, as professionals tested each other's skill and nerve. Barbara took position in the church tower, her brass telescope revealing every detail of the enemy positions. Jack Robinson had chosen a spot behind a boulder, confident in his concealment. Barbara's first shot took him clean through the head at 400 yards, the bullet striking with the finality of divine judgment. Dorothy Ruiz tried to flank the church, but Sarah Mitchell was waiting with a shotgun and 40 years of experience in close-quarters combat. The initial assault broke against the prepared defenses like waves against granite cliffs. Howard's men had expected to face frightened townspeople, not a coordinated defense by trained professionals. They fell back to regroup, leaving 4 dead and twice that number wounded. But Howard was not finished. As darkness fell, he sent teams to try infiltrating the town from multiple directions. They crept through shadows and ruins, seeking gaps in the defense that simply did not exist. Barbara had learned urban warfare in a dozen frontier towns, fighting alongside marshals and soldiers who understood that every building was a fortress, every street a killing ground. She moved through Copper Creek like a ghost, appearing where needed, striking without warning, vanishing before retaliation could find her. Hannah Castillo tried to burn the saloon, but found herself face to face with Barbara in the alley behind the building. The fight was brief and brutal, ending with Castillo unconscious and tied to a hitching post for the morning sun to find. Gloria Cox had better luck initially, managing to set fire to the old stable before Barbara's people could stop her. But the wind was wrong, and the flames spread toward Howard's camp instead of the town. 3 of his men died in the grass fire, and the rest spent the night fighting to save their supplies. Dawn brought a temporary ceasefire as both sides counted their losses and planned their next moves. Howard had lost 8 men in the first night's fighting, while Barbara's defenders had suffered only minor wounds. The disparity was telling, and some of Howard's remaining mercenaries began to mutter about cutting their losses and riding away. But Howard was beyond reason now. His wounded pride had curdled into obsession, and he would see Copper Creek burned to ash before he admitted defeat. He sent riders to Silver Falls and Tombstone, offering double wages for anyone willing to join his crusade against the ghost. Barbara used the lull to strengthen her defenses and tend to her people. The townspeople who had stayed were holding up well, their fear transformed into grim determination by the night's success. They had faced professional killers and emerged victorious, and that knowledge gave them strength. Doc Patterson worked tirelessly to treat the wounded, both friend and enemy. Barbara had insisted that Howard's men receive medical care, another example of the mercy that separated her from common outlaws. Some of the captured mercenaries were so impressed by this treatment that they offered to switch sides, though Barbara politely declined their services. The second assault came at noon when the sun was highest and shadows shortest. Howard had learned from his first failure and concentrated his remaining forces for a direct assault on the main street. 15 men charged the barricades, their guns blazing and their voices raised in rebel yells. Barbara met them in the street, her Colt speaking with deadly precision. She moved like a dancer, flowing from cover to cover, each shot finding its mark with mechanical certainty. Behind her, the other defenders poured fire into the attacking force, turning the street into a cauldron of smoke and lead. The charge broke within minutes, the survivors fleeing back to their ridge in disorder. Howard himself had led the attack, and only Barbara's conscious decision to wound rather than kill had saved his life. He crawled away with a bullet through his leg, his dreams of easy conquest shattered like glass. That night, most of his remaining men deserted. They had signed on to terrorize a defenseless town, not to assault a fortress defended by legends. By morning, Howard had only 5 men left, and 3 of those were wounded. Barbara could have ended it then, with a single shot from her position in the church tower. Howard made an easy target as he raged and cursed in his camp, his sanity clearly slipping. But something held her back. Perhaps the memory of the man she had been before the violence. Perhaps simple human decency. Instead, she walked out of town alone, her rifle slung across her back and her hands empty of weapons. She approached Howard's camp under the white flag of parley, though she knew he might shoot her down out of spite and madness. Howard was sitting by his fire, his wounded legs stretched out before him. His remaining men watched nervously as Barbara approached, their hands hovering near their guns. She stopped just outside the circle of firelight, her gray eyes reflecting the flames. "It is over, Howard," she said quietly. "Take your men and go home." Howard looked up at her with eyes that held more pain than his physical wounds could account for. "You destroyed me," he whispered. "Everything I built, everything I was." "You destroyed yourself," Barbara replied. "I gave you a chance to walk away. You chose this path. I cannot go back. My father will disown me. My reputation is ruined. You have taken everything from me." "Then build something new," Barbara said. "Somewhere else, with different choices. But not here. Never here." For a moment, Howard's face crumpled like a child's, and Barbara saw the scared boy beneath the bluster and violence. Then his expression hardened again, and his hand crept toward his pistol. "Do not," Barbara said, her voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "You will not clear leather before I put you down, and I am tired of killing." Howard's hands stopped, trembling with frustrated rage. His remaining men watched the confrontation with fascination and terror, understanding that they were witnessing something that would become legend. "1 week," Barbara said, 7 days to be gone from this territory. If I see you again, if you send others, if you so much as write a threatening letter, I will finish what you started. And next time, I will not be merciful." She turned and walked back toward town, her back straight and unafraid. Howard could have shot her down, but something in her bearing, some quality of absolute competence and controlled danger, stayed his hand. He watched her disappear into the darkness, then began the painful process of accepting defeat. True to his word, Howard was gone within the week. His remaining men scattered to the 4 winds, carrying tales of the Copper Creek ghost that would grow in the telling. Some said she could shoot the wings off a fly at 1,000 yards. Others claimed she could track a man across solid rock and through running water. All agreed that crossing her was a mistake no one made twice. Barbara returned to her quiet life, serving drinks and cooking meals for the travelers who passed through Copper Creek. But she no longer hid her true nature. The gun belt stayed on her hips, and the rifle hung within easy reach behind the bar. The townspeople treated her with a mixture of respect and awe, understanding that they were protected by someone truly formidable. Letters arrived regularly from old friends and colleagues, some seeking advice, others offering assistance. The network that had once enforced law in the wild territories was older now, more scattered, but still connected by bonds of mutual respect and shared danger. Barbara had become a node in that network, a place where justice could find refuge and evil would find reckoning. 6 months after the siege of Copper Creek, a young woman arrived on the evening stage. She was perhaps 25, with dark hair and intelligent eyes, and she carried herself with the careful balance of someone trained in violence. She asked for a room and a meal, paying with silver coins that bore the mark of the federal mint. Barbara served her dinner in the common room, noting the way the woman's eyes cataloged exits and assessed threats. When the other patrons had retired for the evening, the woman approached the bar where Barbara was cleaning glasses. "Deputy Marshal Elena Vasquez," the woman said quietly, showing a badge identical to the one Barbara kept hidden upstairs. "I have been sent to ask for your help." Barbara continued polishing the glass in her hands, her expression neutral. "I am retired, Marshal Vasquez, so I have been told. But there is a situation that requires someone with your particular skills, someone who can track the untrackable and shoot the unshootable." Barbara set down the glass and met the younger woman's eyes. "What kind of situation?" "A federal judge has been kidnapped. Judge Harrison, who has been trying the railroad corruption cases. We believe he is being held somewhere in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, but our regular trackers have found nothing. The kidnappers are professionals, ex-military, and they have covered their trail perfectly." Barbara considered this, weighing the quiet life she had built against the call of duty that had once defined her. "How long has he been missing?" 4 days. We estimate he has perhaps a week before they decide he is too dangerous to keep alive." The decision was easier than Barbara had expected. Some things were more important than personal peace, and justice was one of them. She nodded slowly, already planning the equipment she would need. "I will require supplies and a good horse, and I work alone." Marshal Vasquez smiled with relief. "Whatever you need, the department will cover all expenses." Barbara closed the saloon early and spent the night preparing for the hunt. She selected her best rifle, a custom-built weapon that could reach out and touch targets at distances that defied belief. Her saddlebags were packed with jerky, hardtack, and ammunition, enough for a week in hostile territory. She rode out before dawn, following the trail that federal agents had already trampled beyond recognition. But Barbara was not looking for obvious signs. She read the land itself, understanding how men moved through wilderness and what traces they could not help but leave. The trail led into the high country, through forests of pine and aspen, across streams that ran cold with snowmelt. Barbara found the first real sign 20 miles from town, a single hoof print in soft earth beside a hidden spring. The shoe was new, expensive, the kind used by men who could afford the best equipment. From there, the trail became clearer to her trained eye. Broken twigs, displaced stones, the faint scent of tobacco smoke carried on the wind. The kidnappers were good, but they were not ghosts. They left traces for someone who knew how to read them. On the second day, she found their first camp, a cleared space beside a mountain stream where they had felt safe enough to build a fire. Barbara studied the ashes, the arrangement of stones, the way they had picketed their horses. 7 men, well-equipped, disciplined in their movements. Military training was evident in every detail. But they had made one mistake. They had assumed that no one could follow them into this wilderness, and that assumption had made them careless. Barbara found the trail leading deeper into the mountains, toward the old mining camps where a man could disappear for months without being found. The pursuit became a deadly game of patience and skill. Barbara followed at a distance, using her telescope to observe their movements without being seen. The kidnappers were indeed professionals, but they were operating in her element now. These mountains were her territory, and she knew every trail, every hiding place, every vantage point. On the third day, she found their main camp in a box canyon similar to the one where she had trapped Howard's men. They had chosen well, with good fields of fire and only one way in or out. But they had not counted on someone who could approach from above, moving like smoke through the pine trees. Judge Harrison was alive, but clearly suffering. He was an older man, perhaps 60, and the rough treatment had taken its toll. He was bound hand and foot, guarded constantly by at least 2 men. The others took turns on watch, their discipline evident in the way they rotated duties and maintained security. Barbara settled into position on the canyon rim, her rifle trained on the camp below. She could have ended it quickly with 6 shots, but the judge was too close to the guards. One mistake, one bullet that went wide, and an innocent man would die. She needed a different approach. That night, she became the ghost of legend. She moved through their camp like a whisper, leaving no trace of her presence except for the gradual disappearance of their sentries. The first guard simply vanished from his post, found hours later tied and gagged in a ravine half a mile away. The second suffered the same fate, awakening to find himself bound with his own rope and helpless as a newborn. By dawn, only 3 kidnappers remained, and they were beginning to panic. Their leader, a scarred man with sergeant's stripes tattooed on his arm, tried to maintain order, but fear was eating at his men's discipline like acid. "She is out there," one of them whispered, his rifle shaking in his hands. "The ghost. I heard about her from a man who rode with Howard. She can kill you from a mile away, and you will never see it coming." "Shut up," the leader snarled, but his own voice lacked conviction. "Nobody is that good." Barbara's voice drifted down from the canyon rim like smoke. "I am giving you one chance to surrender. Release the judge and walk away, and you will live to see another sunrise." The leader raised his rifle toward the sound, but there was nothing to shoot at except empty rock and shadow. "Show yourself," he shouted. "Fight like a man." The answering shot took his hat clean off his head, the bullet passing so close that it singed his hair. The message was clear. She could have killed him easily, but chose not to. Yet, the remaining 2 kidnappers broke and ran, abandoning their leader and their captive in their desperate flight. Barbara let them go, her attention focused on the man who still held a gun on Judge Harrison. "Last chance," she called down. "Drop your weapon and step away from the judge." The scarred man's nerve finally cracked. He had faced enemy fire in a dozen battles, but this was different. This was being hunted by something that moved like wind and shot like divine judgment. He threw down his rifle and raised his hands, his face white with terror. Barbara rappelled down the canyon wall, her movements smooth and confident. She kept her rifle trained on the surrendering kidnapper while she cut the judge's bonds with her knife. Judge Harrison rubbed his wrists where the ropes had chafed, his eyes wide with amazement. "Marshal Santos, I presume. Your reputation precedes you." Barbara helped him to his feet, noting that he was stronger than he appeared. The kidnappers had not broken his spirit, merely inconvenienced him. "Are you injured, Your Honor?" "Nothing that will not heal," the judge replied. "Though I confess I was beginning to lose hope of rescue." "Hope is a luxury in this business," Barbara said, securing the prisoner with his own rope. "But justice is a necessity." The journey back to civilization took 3 days, with Barbara leading and the captured kidnapper riding under guard. Judge Harrison proved to be excellent company, regaling her with stories of his years on the frontier bench and the colorful characters he had sentenced. His gratitude was genuine but not effusive, the mark of a man who understood that some debts could never be fully repaid. The trial of the remaining kidnapper was swift and decisive. Judge Harrison recused himself due to his involvement, but his replacement showed no mercy to men who would abduct federal officials. The scarred man received 20 years in federal prison, while his escaped companions were added to the wanted lists with substantial bounties on their heads. Barbara testified at the trial, her quiet competence impressing the court and the assembled reporters. Stories appeared in newspapers from Denver to San Francisco, reviving the legend of the Copper Creek ghost and adding new chapters to her growing mythology. She accepted the attention with characteristic grace, neither seeking publicity nor hiding from it. The federal marshals offered her a full reinstatement, with rank and pension reflecting her years of service. Barbara considered the offer carefully before declining. She had built a life in Copper Creek, and she was not ready to abandon it for the uncertainties of active duty. But she left the door open for future cooperation, understanding that her skills might be needed again. Word of her return to action spread through the networks of law enforcement and outlawry alike. Some saw opportunity in her renewed activity, while others saw warning. A few brave or foolish souls decided to test themselves against the legend, seeking reputation through confrontation with the ghost. They came to Copper Creek in ones and twos, young gunfighters hungry for fame, and older killers looking to prove their worth. Barbara met each challenge with the same calm professionalism, offering them a chance to leave peacefully before demonstrating why that was their best option. Most took the hint and departed quietly, their pride intact but their ambitions cooled. A few pressed the matter and found themselves outmatched so completely that they questioned their choice of profession. None died, though several required medical attention, and all left with stories that would discourage others from similar attempts. The town of Copper Creek prospered under Barbara's protection. Merchants knew their goods were safe, travelers felt secure on the roads, and honest folk could sleep soundly knowing that justice watched over them. The saloon became a gathering place for those who served the law, a neutral ground where information was shared and alliances forged. Barbara found herself at the center of an informal network of peace officers, retired marshals, and reformed outlaws who had chosen the side of order. They came to her for advice, assistance, and sometimes just companionship with someone who understood the weight of their responsibilities. She welcomed them all, understanding the loneliness that came with their calling. One autumn evening, as the first snows dusted the peaks above Copper Creek, a familiar figure rode into town. Thomas Garrett, the deputy marshal who had helped defend the town against Howard's army, dismounted at the saloon with the careful movements of a man nursing old wounds. Barbara poured him a whiskey without being asked, noting the new lines around his eyes and the way he favored his left shoulder. The years were catching up with all of them, but the job still demanded everything they had to give. "Trouble?" she asked simply. "The worst kind," Garrett replied, downing the whiskey in a single swallow. "Remember Carlos Mendez?" Barbara's expression darkened. Mendez had been a federal prisoner, a cartel leader responsible for dozens of deaths along the border. He had escaped during transport 2 years ago and vanished into the wilderness. Most assumed he had fled to Mexico, but rumors persisted of sightings in the American territories. "He is back," Garrett continued, building a new organization, recruiting from the worst elements on both sides of the border. "Intelligence suggests he is planning something big, something that will require a significant response." "What kind of response?" Barbara asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "The kind that needs someone who can track ghosts and shoot legends," Garrett said with a tired smile. "The kind that needs the ghost herself." Barbara refilled his glass and poured one for herself, considering the implications. Mendez was not like Howard or the kidnappers, men driven by greed or wounded pride. He was a professional killer with resources and connections, someone who would not underestimate an opponent twice. "Where is he?" she asked. "That is the problem," Garrett admitted. "He could be anywhere from Colorado to California, and he has learned to cover his tracks. Regular agents have found nothing and time is running out. Whatever he is planning, it will happen soon." Barbara walked to the window and looked out at the peaceful street of Copper Creek. Children played in the dust while their mothers hung laundry and their fathers tended to the evening chores. It was the life she had fought to protect, the peace she had earned through blood and sacrifice. But peace was not the absence of conflict. It was the presence of those willing to stand against the darkness, to pay the price that others could not afford. She had learned that lesson in a dozen frontier towns, fighting beside men and women who understood that some things were worth any sacrifice. "I will need a week to arrange things here," she said finally, "and I work alone." Garrett nodded, relief evident in his weathered features. "The department will provide whatever support you need, but the operation itself is yours to plan and execute." Barbara turned back to face him, her gray eyes reflecting the lamplight like steel. "Tell them the ghost is hunting again," she said quietly, "and pray that Mendez is not as smart as he thinks he is." The next morning, Barbara began her preparations for what might be her final hunt. She cleaned and oiled her weapons with the reverence of a priest tending sacred relics, each piece of equipment checked and rechecked until it met her exacting standards. The rifle that had served her so faithfully received special attention, its scope adjusted and its action tested until she was satisfied with its readiness. She wrote letters to old friends and allies, activating networks that had lain dormant for years. Some would provide information, others transportation or supplies. A few would offer their lives if needed. The ultimate expression of trust between those who had faced death together. The townspeople of Copper Creek watched her preparations with a mixture of pride and concern. They understood that their protector was answering a call that might take her away forever. But they also knew that this was who she was beneath the quiet exterior. The ghost had been sleeping, not dead, and now she was awakening to face a threat that demanded everything she had learned in a lifetime of violence. On her last night in town, Barbara stood on the hill where her husband was buried, his simple headstone marking the grave of a good man who had loved her despite her violent past. She spoke to him in whispers, telling him of her plans and asking for his understanding. The wind through the pine trees might have been his answer, a gentle blessing on the path she had chosen. The hunt for Carlos Mendez began in the borderlands of New Mexico, where the high desert stretched endlessly under a sky the color of burnished copper. Barbara rode alone, her supplies carefully rationed, and her weapons ready for whatever she might find. The trail was cold, weeks old, but she had followed fainter signs across harder ground. She started in the cantinas and trading posts where information was bought and sold like any other commodity. Her reputation opened doors that money could not, and gradually a picture emerged of Mendez's movements and intentions. He was recruiting heavily, offering gold to anyone willing to follow him on what he called his final enterprise. The pattern suggested a man preparing for war, not crime. Mendez was gathering soldiers, not thieves, and the weapons he was purchasing were military grade. Barbara began to suspect that his target was not a bank or train, but something far more significant. A breakthrough came in the form of a dying man she found beside a waterhole in the desert. He had been shot and left to die, but he lived long enough to whisper a few crucial words. Mendez was moving north toward the Colorado Territory, and he carried with him plans that would shake the foundations of the territorial government. Barbara followed the trail through landscapes that would have defeated lesser trackers. Mendez was good, perhaps the best she had ever pursued, but he could not completely erase his passage from the earth. She found signs in the arrangement of stones, the direction of broken twigs, the faint scent of tobacco smoke that lingered in sheltered places. The pursuit led her through Apache territory, where she was forced to negotiate passage with warriors who remembered her from earlier campaigns. They granted her safe conduct out of respect for her reputation, but warned her that Mendez had also passed this way, and his men had not been so respectful of tribal lands. She found evidence of Mendez's passage in a burned trading post in the bodies of 3 Apache scouts who had tried to stop him. The brutality was unnecessary, the mark of a man who killed for pleasure as well as purpose. Barbara studied the scene with professional detachment, adding this crime to the list of charges that would never see a courtroom. The trail led higher into the mountains, toward the mining camps and lumber towns that dotted the Colorado Rockies. Barbara followed with the patience of a predator, knowing that haste would only alert her quarry to her presence. She was one woman against perhaps 30 armed men, and surprise was her only advantage. She found Mendez's main camp in an abandoned mining town called Silver Ridge, a place that had died when the ore played out and the miners moved on to richer claims. The buildings were intact but empty, providing perfect cover for a small army that preferred to remain hidden from prying eyes. Barbara established her observation post on a ridge overlooking the town, using her telescope to study the enemy positions and count their strength. Mendez had chosen his location well, with good fields of fire and multiple escape routes through the surrounding mountains. But he had not counted on being found by someone who could read the land like a book. The plan that emerged from her surveillance was audacious beyond belief. Mendez intended to attack the territorial capital during the governor's annual address to the legislature, killing the entire territorial government in one coordinated assault. With the leadership dead, he would install his own puppet regime and effectively control the entire Colorado territory. It was a plan worthy of a military genius, and Barbara had to admit a grudging respect for its scope and ambition. But it was also the work of a madman, a scheme that would plunge the entire region into chaos and bloodshed. She could not allow it to succeed. The distance to the nearest telegraph was 3 days hard riding, too far to summon help before Mendez put his plan into motion. Barbara would have to stop him herself, one woman against 30 killers in a fortified position. The odds were impossible, but she had faced impossible odds before. She spent 2 days studying the camp, learning the routines and weaknesses of Mendez's small army. They were disciplined but overconfident, secure in their isolation and numerical superiority. They posted guards but did not expect attack from a single opponent, and that complacency would be their downfall. Barbara began her assault at midnight, moving through the abandoned town like a shadow. Her first targets were the sentries, men who vanished silently from their posts without raising an alarm. She used techniques learned in a dozen campaigns, striking without sound and leaving no trace of her passage. The main attack began with the explosion of their ammunition dump, a carefully placed charge that turned their supplies into a pillar of fire visible for miles. In the confusion that followed, Barbara moved through the camp like an avenging angel, her rifle speaking with deadly precision. Mendez's men were professionals, but they had never faced anything like the ghost in full fury. She appeared and vanished like smoke, striking from impossible angles and disappearing before they could return fire. Their discipline cracked under the supernatural assault, and men who had faced cavalry charges fled in terror from a single woman. The battle raged through the night, a running fight among the abandoned buildings of Silver Ridge. Barbara used every trick she had learned in 30 years of warfare, turning the town itself into a weapon against its occupiers. Buildings became fortresses, alleys became killing grounds, and rooftops became snipers' nests from which death descended without warning. By dawn, half of Mendez's force was dead or wounded, and the survivors were scattered through the mountains in full retreat. The plan to attack the territorial government died with them, the conspiracy shattered by one woman's refusal to accept the impossible. But Mendez himself had escaped in the chaos, and Barbara knew that he would not give up easily. Men like him did not surrender. They simply found new ways to strike at their enemies. The hunt would continue until one of them was dead. She found his trail leading deeper into the high country, toward the peaks where snow never melted and the air was thin enough to kill. It was a desperate flight, the path of a man who had lost everything and sought only to drag his enemy down with him. The final confrontation came at Timberline, where the trees gave way to bare rock and endless sky. Mendez had chosen his ground well, a narrow ledge with his back to a 1,000-foot drop and only one approach. He waited with a rifle in the patience of a man who had nothing left to lose. Barbara approached openly, her own weapon ready but not raised. She could have ended it with a long shot from cover, but something in her demanded a face-to-face reckoning with this man who had caused so much death and suffering. They faced each other across 50 yards of open ground, two professionals who understood that only one would leave this place alive. Mendez was younger and perhaps faster, but Barbara carried the weight of absolute certainty that her cause was just. "The ghost," Mendez said, his voice carrying clearly in the thin air. "I wondered when you would find me." "It was inevitable," Barbara replied. "You left too many bodies in your wake, and now you will join them," Mendez snarled, bringing his rifle to bear. But Barbara was already moving, her own weapon speaking with the voice of justice itself. The bullet took Mendez center mass, spinning him around and sending him tumbling into the abyss below. His scream echoed off the canyon walls before being swallowed by the wind. Barbara stood on the ledge for a long moment, watching the spot where her enemy had disappeared. There was no satisfaction in the kill, only the grim knowledge that a necessary task had been completed. Justice was not about revenge, but about protecting those who could not protect themselves. The return journey to Copper Creek took Barbara through landscapes that seemed different now, marked by the knowledge that she had once again taken life in service of the law. The weight of it settled on her shoulders like an old coat, familiar but never comfortable. She had killed before, would probably kill again, but each death left its mark on her soul. She stopped in Denver to file her report with the federal marshals, providing details of Mendez's plan and the location of his scattered followers. The territorial government would need to increase security and watch for signs of the remaining conspirators, but the immediate threat had been neutralized. Marshal Garrett met her at the federal building, his relief evident when she walked through the door alive and unharmed. The reports from Silver Ridge had been fragmentary, but the explosion and gunfire had been visible from settlements 20 miles away. Some had feared that the ghost herself had finally met her match. 30 men, Garrett said, shaking his head in amazement. You took on 30 armed men and lived to tell about it. 28, Barbara corrected. Two escaped into the mountains. They will surface eventually, and when they do, someone will be waiting. The debriefing took most of the day, with Barbara providing detailed accounts of Mendez's organization and methods. The information would be distributed to law enforcement agencies throughout the territories, helping to prevent similar conspiracies from taking root. Knowledge was often more valuable than bullets in the long war against lawlessness. That evening, Barbara sat in her hotel room and wrote letters to the families of those who had died because of Mendez's ambitions. It was a task she had performed many times over the years, but it never became easier. How did you explain to a widow that her husband's death had served a greater purpose? How did you comfort children who would never see their father again? She mailed the letters the next morning and boarded the stage for Copper Creek, eager to return to the peace she had fought so hard to protect. The other passengers gave her respectful distance, recognizing something in her bearing that suggested recent violence. She did not mind the solitude, using the time to plan her return to civilian life. The stage rolled into Copper Creek just as the sun was setting behind the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Barbara stepped down onto the familiar dust of the main street and felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. She was home, and the people she cared about were safe. The townspeople emerged from their shops and homes to welcome her back, their faces reflecting relief and pride in equal measure. They had followed the reports in the territorial newspapers, understanding that their quiet saloon keeper had once again answered the call of duty. Children who had been forbidden to approach her before now ran up with shy smiles and whispered questions about her adventures. Barbara reopened the saloon the next morning, falling back into the rhythms of civilian life with practiced ease. She served drinks and cooked meals, listened to gossip and settled minor disputes, all while keeping one eye on the street and one hand near her weapon. Old habits died hard, and vigilance was the price of peace. But the peace was different now, deeper and more secure. Word of her victory over Mendez had spread through the networks of both law and lawlessness, carrying a clear message. Copper Creek was protected by someone who could not be intimidated, bribed, or defeated. Those who came seeking trouble would find more than they bargained for. Letters arrived regularly from across the territories, some offering employment, others seeking advice, a few simply expressing gratitude for her service. Barbara answered them all with the same careful attention, understanding that her reputation carried responsibilities as well as privileges. She had become a symbol of justice in a land where justice was often in short supply. One letter stood out from the rest, bearing the seal of the territorial governor himself. Inside was an offer of appointment as territorial marshal, a position that would give her authority over all law enforcement in Colorado. It was an honor that few could refuse, but Barbara set it aside without serious consideration. She had found her place in Copper Creek, and no amount of prestige could tempt her to abandon it. Winter came early that year, blanketing the mountains in snow and driving the last of the travelers indoors. The saloon became a gathering place for those who could not or would not leave, a warm refuge from the bitter cold outside. Barbara found herself playing hostess to an eclectic mix of miners, ranchers, and drifters, all united by their need for shelter and human companionship. Among the winter guests was an elderly man who called himself Professor Williams, though his true identity remained mysterious. He claimed to be writing a book about the frontier, but his questions suggested a deeper interest in the legends and stories that shaped the territory's history. Barbara found herself the subject of his gentle interrogation, though she revealed little beyond what was already public knowledge. One evening, as a blizzard howled outside and the fire crackled in the hearth, Professor Williams approached Barbara at the bar. He had been drinking steadily but remained articulate, his eyes sharp with intelligence and something that might have been recognition. "You know," he said quietly, "I once knew a woman very much like you. Same steel in her spine, same willingness to stand against the darkness. She died protecting a wagon train from Apache raiders 20 years ago this spring." Barbara continued polishing glasses, her expression neutral. "The frontier is full of such stories, Professor. Heroes and villains, all mixed together until you can not tell one from the other. But you can tell," Williams insisted, "that is what makes you different. You understand the difference between justice and revenge, between necessary violence and cruelty. It is a rare gift in these times." Barbara met his eyes, seeing something there that spoke of shared experience and hard-won wisdom. "What is your real name, Professor?" William smiled, an expression that transformed his weathered features. "Colonel James Morrison, United States Army, retired. I commanded the garrison at Fort Collins before my health forced me to step down. I have been following your career with great interest, Marshal Santos." Barbara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather outside. Morrison's name was legend among those who served the law, a man who had brought order to the wildest corners of the frontier through a combination of tactical genius and unshakable moral courage. If he was here, it was not for his health or his book. "What do you want, Colonel?" she asked quietly. "To offer you something, king, that money cannot buy," Morrison replied. "A chance to leave a legacy that will outlast us all. A chance to build something permanent in this land of temporary solutions." He reached into his coat and withdrew a leather portfolio, setting it carefully on the bar between them. Inside were documents bearing official seals and signatures, proposals for a new kind of law enforcement organization that would span the entire western frontier. "The Territorial Rangers," Morrison explained, "elite peace officers with authority across state and territorial boundaries, answerable only to the federal government and their own code of honor. Men and women chosen for their skill and integrity, trained to handle the worst situations and equipped with the best resources." Barbara studied the documents, recognizing the scope and ambition of the proposal. It was nothing less than a complete reorganization of frontier law enforcement, creating a force that could respond to threats regardless of political boundaries or local corruption. "Why me?" she asked. "Because you are already what we hope to create," Morrison said simply. "You have proven that one person with the right skills and motivations can make a difference that echoes across an entire territory. Imagine what 100 such people could accomplish." The offer was tempting, but Barbara had learned to be cautious of grand schemes and noble causes. She had seen too many good intentions corrupted by politics and ambition, too many heroes destroyed by the very system they tried to serve. "I will consider it," she said finally, "but I make no promises." Morrison nodded, understanding the weight of what he was asking. "The offer stands, Marshal Santos. When you are ready, we will be waiting." He left the portfolio on the bar and Risita returned to his table, resuming his role as a harmless old professor, writing about frontier history. But Barbara knew that their conversation had changed something fundamental, opening a door to possibilities she had never considered. She spent the rest of the winter thinking about Morrison's offer, weighing the potential benefits against the certain costs. The Territorial Rangers could indeed make a difference, bringing professional law enforcement to places that had never known real justice. But it would also mean leaving Copper Creek, abandoning the peace she had fought so hard to build. Spring came late to the high country, but when it finally arrived, it brought more than melting snow and budding trees. A young woman rode into Copper Creek on a fine bay horse, her travel-worn clothes and confident bearing marking her as someone accustomed to long journeys and uncertain destinations. She introduced herself as Deputy Marshal Sarah Chen, recently graduated from the Federal Law Enforcement Academy in Washington. She had been assigned to the Colorado Territory and specifically requested to work under Barbara's supervision, having studied her cases and methods during her training. Barbara accepted the young woman's credentials with some amusement, remembering her own early days as a deputy when experience was measured in survival rather than classroom hours. Chen was clearly intelligent and well-trained, but the frontier would test her in ways that no academy could simulate. The test came sooner than expected. A gang of claim jumpers had been terrorizing the mining camps north of Copper Creek, using violence and intimidation to steal productive claims from legitimate prospectors. The local sheriff was either corrupt or incompetent, and the territorial government seemed powerless to intervene. Barbara decided to investigate personally, taking Chen along as both backup and education. They rode into the mining district on a crisp morning in early May, the air still sharp with the memory of winter, but warmed by the promise of summer to come. The mining camp of Goldfield was a study in contrast, with genuine prosperity existing alongside grinding poverty and desperation. Those who had struck it rich lived in relative comfort, while those still searching for their fortune made do with tents and lean-tos scattered along the creek beds and hillsides. The claim jumpers had established themselves as the unofficial authority in the district, collecting protection money and settling disputes through violence rather than law. Their leader was a man named Big Jack Morrison, no relation to the colonel despite the shared name, who had built his reputation on the broken bones and shattered dreams of those who opposed him. Barber and Chen established themselves in the camp's only hotel, a ramshackle building that offered beds and meals of questionable quality. They posed as investors looking to purchase claims, a cover that allowed them to move freely through the district while gathering intelligence on Morrison's operation. The corruption was deeper than Barber had expected, reaching from the camp's saloons and gambling dens all the way to the territorial offices in Denver. Morrison had built a network of bribes and intimidation that made him effectively untouchable through normal legal channels. But Barbara had never been particularly concerned with normal legal channels. She had learned long ago that sometimes justice required methods that would not pass scrutiny in a courtroom, and this seemed like one of those times. The confrontation began when Morrison's men tried to shake down an elderly prospector named Heinrich Muller, a German immigrant who had been working his claim for 3 years without finding more than pocket change. The thugs demanded payment for protection he neither wanted nor needed, and when he refused, they began destroying his equipment. Barbara intervened with the calm efficiency that had made her legend, appearing between Muller and his tormentors like an avenging angel. Her presence alone was enough to give the thugs pause, but when they recognized her, their casual arrogance turned to nervous uncertainty. "You boys are making a mistake," Barbara said quietly, her hand resting casually on her gun butt. "Mr. Muller is under federal protection now." The lead thug, a scarred man with the build of a professional brawler, tried to bluster his way through the confrontation. "This is not your concern, lady. Big Jack runs this camp, and what he says goes." "Big Jack does not run anything," Barbara replied. "He is a criminal operating outside the law, and his protection ends today." The thug reached for his gun, but Barbara was already moving. Her Colt cleared leather and fired before he could draw, the bullet taking him through the shoulder and spinning him around. His companions scattered like leaves before a hurricane, their courage evaporating in the face of professional competence. Word of the confrontation spread through the camp like wildfire, carrying with it the news that the Copper Creek ghost had come to Goldfield. Some of Morrison's men began to reconsider their employment, while others prepared for a war they were not sure they could win. Morrison himself was made of sterner stuff, a veteran of the Civil War who had learned his trade in the brutal campaigns of the Shenandoah Valley. He gathered his remaining followers and prepared to make a stand, understanding that retreat would mean the end of his profitable empire. The final battle took place in the camp's main street, a classic frontier showdown that would be remembered and embellished for generations to come. Morrison and 5 of his best men faced Barbara and Chen in the dusty space between the hotel and the general store, with half the camp watching from windows and doorways. It was over in seconds. Barbara's first shot took Morrison center mass, while Chen proved her academy training by putting down 2 of his men with quick, clean shots. The remaining thugs threw down their weapons and surrendered, their leader's death ending their resistance as effectively as a sword through the heart. The cleanup took several days, with Barbara and Chen working to restore legitimate authority to the mining district. Corrupt officials were arrested or fled, honest lawmen were appointed to replace them, and the miners were finally free to work their claims without fear of extortion or violence. Deputy Chen had proven herself admirably during the crisis, displaying both courage and competence under fire. Barbara wrote a glowing report of her performance, recommending her for promotion and assignment to more challenging duties. The young woman had the potential to become an excellent peace officer, given proper guidance and experience. But the incident at Goldfield had also reinforced Barbara's growing sense that individual actions, however successful, were not enough to address the systemic problems facing the frontier. Morrison's operation had been destroyed, but others would rise to take its place unless something fundamental changed in how law enforcement was organized and funded. Colonel Morrison's offer began to look more attractive as Barbara considered the scope of the challenges facing the territories. The territorial rangers could indeed make a difference, providing the kind of professional, coordinated response that situations like Goldfield required. But it would mean leaving Copper Creek, and Barbara was not sure she was ready for that sacrifice. The decision was made for her by events beyond her control. A telegram arrived from Washington bearing news that would change everything she thought she knew about her future. The federal government was reorganizing its territorial law enforcement, and Barbara Santos had been selected to head the new organization, whether she wanted the job or not. The appointment came with the rank of Chief Marshal in authority over all federal law enforcement west of the Mississippi River. It was a position of enormous responsibility and power, but it also meant leaving behind the quiet life she had built in Copper Creek. Barbara read the telegram twice before setting it aside and walking to the window. Outside, the familiar street stretched away toward the mountains, peaceful and secure under her protection. Children played in the dust while their parents went about their daily business, all of them safe because she had chosen to make this place her home. But safety was not just about one town or one protector. It was about building systems that could endure beyond any individual, creating institutions that would serve justice long after the current generation was gone. The territorial rangers represented that kind of lasting change, and Barbara finally understood that her duty lay not in preserving her own peace, but in helping others find theirs. She composed her acceptance telegram that evening, formally agreeing to take command of the new organization. The words came slowly, each one representing another step away from the life she had known and toward a future filled with uncertainty and challenge. The announcement of her appointment made headlines in newspapers from San Francisco to New York, with editorials praising the choice and predicting great things for frontier law enforcement. The Copper Creek Ghost was riding again, this time with the full authority of the federal government behind her. But first, she had to say goodbye to the town that had been her sanctuary and the people who had become her family. The farewell party lasted 3 days, with visitors coming from across the territory to honor the woman who had brought peace to their corner of the world. Barbara accepted their gratitude with characteristic grace, but her mind was already turning toward the challenges ahead. The territorial rangers would need to be recruited, trained, and equipped. Criminals who had operated with impunity would have to be brought to justice. An entire system of frontier law enforcement would have to be built from the ground up. It was the kind of challenge that would have daunted most people, but Barbara Santos had never been most people. She was the Copper Creek Ghost, the woman who had tamed the wildest corners of the frontier through skill, courage, and an unshakable commitment to justice. The legend was about to become something even greater.